Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1152nd New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Tacita Dean, Edmund de Waal, Dr. Alice Ensabella, Joel Meyerowitz, Luc Tuymans, and Amanda Gluibizzi. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. Tacita Dean is a British-European artist. Her recent solo exhibitions include the Menil Collection in Houston, Bourse de Commerce at the Pinault Collection in Paris, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney. In his visual art and literary works, artist Edmund de Waal uses objects as vehicles for human narrative, emotion, and history. His installations of handmade porcelain vessels, often contained in minimalist structures, investigate themes of diaspora, memory, and materiality. Dr. Alice Ensabella is Associate Professor in Contemporary Art History at the University of Grenoble-Alpes and an independent curator. She is the curator of the exhibition Giorgio Morandi, Masterpieces from the Magnani-Rocca Foundation, currently on view at David Zwirner and the subject of today's conversation. Joel Meyerowitz is an award-winning photographer whose work has appeared in over 350 exhibitions in museums and galleries around the world. Luc Tuymans is an artist who lives and works in Antwerp, one of the first artists to be represented by David Zwirner. Tuymans has had 17 exhibitions with the gallery since joining its roster in 1994. And our host today, Amanda Gluibizzi, is a former associate professor at Ohio State University, the founding co-editor of the New Foundation for Art History and ArtSeen editor for the Brooklyn Rail. She specializes in mid and late 20th century art, design, and urbanism in the United States, Europe, and Latin America. Amanda is the author of Art and Design in 1960s New York. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Amanda to get us started. Thank you all for joining us today.
Yes, thank you everyone so much for being here. And let me start by saying, first of all, thank you to Alice and also to the artists on our panel. And also thank you to the teams at the Rail, at David Zwirner, and the studios for helping us to get everything together. And then, of course, thank you, Chloe, so much, because this is an amazing feat of collegiality and also organization. And so I am totally impressed by you. So let's get started. First, we're going to begin with Alice, who is going to briefly walk us through the show in case you aren't in New York or are in New York but haven't been able to get to Zwirner yet. And if you're in New York, why haven't you gotten to this show yet? So Alice, tell us how this exhibition came about, working with the Magnani, and also your decisions for the installation.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you, Chloe, for introducing me, and thank you for organizing this beautiful discussion. I will talk just a few minutes to introduce to you some highlights about this show that is currently on view at the David Zwirner Gallery on 20th Street in New York. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I cannot wait to hear the following part of this discussion regarding the artist and the influence that Morandi still have as today on these contemporary practices. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. Sorry, tonight. I'm in Europe, so it's nighttime for me. Sorry if I say tonight. So just a few words about this project that started a few years ago. The David Zwirner Gallery is the third venue of this show. That has already been organized in Grenoble in 2021 at the Musée de Grenoble, in 2023 at the Astori Collection in London, and now that is displayed in New York. What is really beautiful with this collection is that if you have seen the free exhibition, you have the feeling that you see three different shows, not having the feeling that you've seen maybe sometimes the same works. And I have to say that, of course, the installation plays a key role in this sense on how we perceive this collection. And I have to say that I'm pretty happy about this installation in New York City, which, according to me, is one of the most powerful. I mean, in terms of possibility for the works to breathe, to have space, and also in the sense that we finally get to, I think, give the real sense, deep sense of this all of the collection. I will tell you why. So. We are displaying the collection of Giorgio Morandi, of the 50 Giorgio Morandis, belonging to the collection of Luigi Magnani, who was a musicologist, art historian, collector, who had the chance to know the artist and became to be one of these closest friends. The most of the collection has been built between 1940, the year in which they met, and the following 20 years, so during the living of Giorgio Morandi. And I think that some people that have already seen the show, and we talk about this, Chloe, at the opening, I think that one of the main characteristics of this collection is that when you look at this, you can find a kind of unexpected Morandi, not just the works that are the most known by the artist. And I think this is a very crucial point of this ensemble, of this collection, because the most of the pieces has been chosen by the artist himself for this collection. So in the press release, we stated something strong, but we have the feeling that this collection has been curated by Morandi himself. So the idea in the installation was to show this peculiarity of the collection. We displayed just a selection of works, not the 50 works are on display, but only 36. I'll tell you later why, because we wanted to create a balance, and also we wanted to show how this collection showed in some way the whole career of the artist. So all the periods of his career are represented, and it is structured chronologically. So if you go through the 4 rooms, you start from the very beginnings of the career of the artist to the very late works. The latest works are from 1963, so 1 year before he passed. You can also find all the subjects that he treated. Sometimes we say that Morandi treats only one subject. I mean, that realized only one kind of works during all his life. Of course, there are some recurrent subjects, but I think that is in this show you can find some very rare pieces in which he experimented, and he tried to compare himself to other subjects, and also there is an important richness of the different techniques. We always, in big shows about Morandi's work, we have this way to focus on paintings, of course, and to put sometimes apart the works on paper, most of all etchings, which are actually a very important part of his activity, of his discipline, of his attitude towards his art. So here in the exhibition, we did not show only all these periods, all these subjects, but also we put in dialogue all these different techniques, which is something that is very rare in Morandi's shows. So to see how he treats still life through etching, through drawings, watercolors, and of course paintings, which I think it's an approach that reveals also the complexity of the work of this artist, that sometimes is considered defined quite simple and monothematic, and I have my hope is that through this collection that has been built by the artist and that has been also enriched by a collector who deeply knew the artist, the man, too, as he states in the essay that he wrote, you can discover a more complex Morandi. So just very quickly to give you a few chronological repairs about the exhibition. In the very first room, you have early works with some of the most maybe unexpected Morandis. So we have here very rare pieces from the early years, of course, the Natura Morta Metafisica, this beautiful painting from 1918, which is, yes, just here. We have we know just only 12 paintings from this period by the artist. We have one of the only 7 self-portraits he ever realized, and also two of the very rare still life with fruits that he realized along the 20s. And we were very proud with David Lieber, that I have to thank again here for discussing together and to put together this beautiful installation. We were very proud of this wall with the 2 still lifes with fruits. So one with this very materic painting, and just close to it, yes, the etching, which shows also how, technically speaking, the artist approach in a different way the same subject. The second room is actually the room in which the collection begins, because it's a room with works from the beginning of the 40s, so the years of the war. Magnani and Morandi met in 1940. So here we have the very first gift that Morandi gave to Magnani. It was an etching with flowers, which was very common for Morandis, a gift that Morandi used to do to his friends. You come to someone with a bouquet of flowers, and he gave etchings with flowers to his friends. And one of the rarest painting in his production, so the only commission he ever accepted on a subject that was chosen by the commissioner. So the still life with with instruments, which is, I don't know if we have, yes, this painting that was, so it's a very a unique piece in the whole production of the artist. In this room, we also have works from the war that are characterized by this very darker palette, long shadows, objects on the edge of their sport. Then a beautiful room with masterpieces from the late 40s and the 50s. So these are excellent and maybe more expected Morandi, so from this golden age of the still lives. And a last room where we can find even more these connections and this dialogue between different techniques, most of all drawings and watercolors, that are 2 techniques that have been very deeply experimented by the artist in the last years of his production, and in which he have the impression that he go towards abstraction. Yeah, this is, I would say, the main ideas behind this show. I don't know, Amanda, if you want me to add something or if it's fine for the moment. And of course, I hope you will see the show, and I will be happy to answer your other questions if you have any. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alice. And again, congratulations on the show. It is, in fact, truly, truly beautiful. And
thank you.
Such an interesting decision to give these very small works so much wall space. It really does place them differently from how I've seen Morandis in the past. I'd like to turn to our artists on the panel and to ask you first just a kind of more general question about how you each first came to Morandi. Each of you have written about Morandi as well, which I think is kind of interesting. And so I'm curious about this too for our audience members who maybe haven't written, or I'm sorry, read your written texts. What do you look for and at when you look at works by Morandi? And if you, as Luc says, know Morandi like the back of your hand, what do you look for when you return to his works? Is there anyone who would like to go first, or do I have to call on someone?
I'll go first.
Thanks, Joel.
When I was an art student back in the 1950s at Ohio State University, by the way, the head of the art history department was a New Yorker, just like I was, although considerably older. And he had gone to New York City to see an exhibition of Morandi's at Columbia University in, I think it was 1957 or 58. Anyway, he came back with some reproductions of Morandi's, and none of us had heard or known about him. And he excitedly showed us some of these works and described how small the canvases were and how, magical they were to him. And that was the first time I had ever encountered any of Morandi's works. And I have to say, having seen what were still lives, more classical still lives, the cloth and the fruit and everything coming off the edge of the table and everything, to see these solemn, well-considered, simple forms was thrilling. And I didn't have a chance to see anything in person until years later. But that first introduction by holding a printed piece of paper from a booklet or whatever was really amazing. It was almost the same size as some of the small paintings.
Edmund, what about you? How did you first come to Morandi?
I was 17. I'd run away from school to Japan to be a potter, and I was obsessed with making things, the presence of bowls, in my hands. I was very dogmatic, and that was going to be my life. It has been my life. And I went to an exhibition at the Tokyo Museum of Western Art in Ueno Park in the spring of 1981. And there was Morandi, and there was this extraordinary disconnect for me between this multitude of objects that I was living with and making and handling their kind of presence in the world, that they were bodily objects, and the space that Morandi had managed to make within these extraordinary paintings. And there was a disconnect for me. I couldn't understand them. I loved them and I wanted them and I needed to be near them, but I couldn't cope with them at the same time. So it was a very early, interesting kind of moment of peril for me. It's like, I want to make all these objects, but at the same time, I want to have the spaces and the quietude and the exactitude that Morandi seemed to offer. So it was an interesting, early, complicated experience for me. But I remember it profoundly, absolutely profoundly.
When you see them now, do you still experience a moment of peril?
So 40 something years on, having spent all that time in Bologna in his studio, worked with his estate, done exhibitions, lived with him, yes, they still are profoundly complicated for me, but the complexity is built, like sort of layers and layers of they haven't got simpler for me. They are still objects. They are objects. They are things that I find testing for me. They're out in the world, for me, in my world, trying to questioning me about how little I can do, about the space between object itself, about dust, about silence, and of course, now 45 years of reading poetry around objects and writing about them, they are also very close to the lyric for me. The relationship between Morandi's particularly late work and poetry has become closer and closer and closer. It's got more complicated. Will that do for you?
Yes.
It's more complicated.
I'll accept it.
Good.
Luc, how about you? How did you first come to Morandi? I know that you've described yourself as somewhat of a skeptic. Are you still a skeptic, or was that just your initial reaction?
But I actually came across Morandi when I saw a film with a painting in it, and Marcello Mastroianni in front of it, probably from Michelangelo Antonioni. My very first encounter with, and of course, I later on saw loads of reproductions, was really interested in it, and then saw the very first time a real show of Morandi, actually by accident in the Sammlung Winter Tour in Switzerland, which was amazing to see because also the paintings were extremely spaced out. And for me, this encounter was something which was extremely familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, in a sense. And what I mean with knowing the painting as the back of my hand is that Morandi is a painter's painter, in a sense. There is this sort of logic which every painter actually would understand. I mean, of course, there are the reminiscences to Chardin, there is Corot, there's all these other Giotto, all these other influences that you can think of. But the most important thing for me was this fact that this element of this familiar and unfamiliarity, also the fact that he was able to make this construction between the idea of, on the one hand, this modernity, and actually also going back to what we actually expect, but it's a sort of confounding form of expectation in which he insists upon this illegibility of the form, which actually then transfigurates this whole element of the real and activates the viewer, which makes them till this day quite stunning and interesting. So the skepticism is something else. That's more about the positioning of the artist within the framework of the time he was working in, which is something that can speak for him or could speak against it. That's something else. In essence, it's something that comes back to you. And in a sense, we could think now, of course, and this could be seen as a criticism or not, is that maybe today Morandi is sort of like, in a sense, looked through our eyes now with the sort of idea of this substantial element of displacement, which sort of like, eases our discomfort.
It's very interesting that you note that you first approached Morandi through mediated means. Now I'm starting to understand perhaps your own practice in relation to Morandi a little bit.
It is also not only that, it fits in the framework, I mean, of how Morandi is perceived and how he was also adulated. I mean, of course, Michelangelo Antonioni is this sort of nearly aristocratic vision within the modernity of film. In that sense, it fits in the situation, like also his reliance on the metaphysics, which is interesting because his form of metaphysical painting is not like the Chirico. It goes much more to the Neue Sachlichkeit.
Mm-hmm. I can see what you mean by that. Thank you. Tacita, how about you? How did you first come to Morandi?
Well, funnily enough, I just watched La Dolce Vita. That's a Morandi in it as well. Fellini. That's a different film, or is that the one you're thinking of? Luc. Anyway, I don't know.
Well, maybe that could be it. Yeah, maybe that's it. Yeah, could be.
Yeah, we were just watching it recently. I can't pretend to say that there was a moment when I remember coming across Morandi. So I'm being honest. I mean, I feel like I've always known about him for a very, very long time, so I can't pretend to say there was a moment of encounter.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel then that he's always on in the background, or is that then, and does that make him an artist that you reach for and know that he's there?
Well, I mean, I think I came from it at a different angle because I was very early on when they just opened the studio. I mean, I always knew about Morandi and I've always, been very attracted to his paintings. But what happened to me is that, having access to the studio and it was just turning back into the studio, because they had it elsewhere for a long time, and then they managed to buy his house and then they reoccupied it. That I went in very early then, and encountered his objects, and then I became more of a detective, and that was my I was very intrigued by the objects and the marks on the everything that you see or you don't see in the paintings that went to the artifice, like the fact that his when you look at his paintings and you think he finds abstraction in the actual depiction, but actually he paints out, he whitewashed the objects to get rid of the reflections, and he covered things in brown paper. So that sort of kind of slightly clottedness of the quality is very much also in the objects themselves. So when I actually saw the objects, it was a very strange thing because they were deeply familiar. Somehow I think Morandi gets into everyone's sort of psyche from a very early age without really understanding, I mean, at least for me, I didn't have this moment of, as I said, first encounter, but I feel like he's always been there somehow in my understanding. I don't know why, but it was, for me, the encounter was the objects themselves, had a very kind of striking moment for me.
Tacita's answer is a perfect segue for my next question, which is about the objects. You have all, I think, been into the studio and have interacted with the objects, some of you very, very directly, and some of you perhaps in more of an observational way. And so I'm interested in that as well, for you to describe these sorts of experiences and to tell us why for you it was necessary to engage with the objects in addition to the works of art. What is it about the objects themselves that really attracted you? And what then did you do with them?
Okay, I'll jump into the silence.
Please do.
As a photographer, I really never made still lives. I photograph on the streets, human behavior, interactions, unexpected moments, things that happen in a thousandth of a second and are gone. And the perception is the game of sight for me. And then a number of years before I was living in Tuscany, I had lived there for almost the last 10 years. 2 years ago, I moved to London. I was working in France and I went to Aix-en-Provence and I saw the Cézanne atelier. And I was stunned that he had painted his entire room a dark gray. And he had all these objects there. And the question of why he chose to paint it gray posed an interesting question for me personally, because we all sort of live in white box studios in contemporary life. Oh, that picture that's on the screen right now is actually my favorite Morandi object. It's just a cone of Fabriano paper with a pin stuck through it. And it's a remarkable sort of tapered cylinder that appears in any number of his paintings. Anyway, I was so struck by the fact that Cézanne chose to use a gray background that I asked the people in the atelier if I could come back and photograph his objects against the gray background. And it was such a compelling experience that when I return to Italy, I thought, I have to inquire about what makes a still life. You know, how do you choose the objects, and how do they gravitate in some way to becoming something more than just that object on the background? And because I wasn't so far from Bologna, I made a pilgrimage to Morandi's studio. And they were very vulnerable. Didn't you all feel that? They said, sure, go ahead, do what you want. And I spent days in there, and I photographed over 300 of his objects. And to pick up an object that he had painted and to turn it around in my hand, to see if there was one aspect of it that seemed to have more vitality or bite or meaning or presence than another part of it. That was an interesting question for me. And I just placed them on his table, and I tried to look at them in his light. I didn't want to make Morandi's. I didn't assemble groups of objects. I just wanted to look at the thing itself to understand, did he commune with these things? Did he turn them also until there was some dent or shade or shape that expressed itself, so that he could then add other objects to it and relate to them in that way? And so it was just a kind of curiosity, a basic curiosity of how does an object relate to you? What do you take from it? Does it emanate any kind of force? How does it relate to other objects? These were just simple observational questions from a photographic point of view, because like the picture that's on the screen now, to me, this is like street photography. This is the kind of assemblage of people in clusters and crowds on the street. And I was trying to find my own dialogue with objects rather than to create a Cézanne still life or a Morandi still life. I wanted to investigate the properties and history of the still life itself. And so really the time spent in Morandi's studio, and Tacita, I wore his hat and his jacket, just like you did. It was so much fun to sort of put it on and inhabit his space and feel the scale of the man. Anyway, I don't know where that leaves us, but that's what my encounter was like.
I'm so interested to hear that you felt like, as a street photographer, you, in Brian O'Doherty's words, still brought your street reflexes with you into Morandi's studio. I find that so interesting, you know, that you're constantly, like, perhaps even looking over your shoulder rather than just looking completely at something. You have to look around the thing to see what's going on. I also love your terminology, what has bite to it. So if you see that in one of my reviews in the next couple of months, everybody will know where that comes from. Tacita, you also have a photograph of yourself in Morandi's hat in his mirror. Can you talk a little bit about being with his things and what it was about the objects themselves that were compelling to you?
Well, actually, I was interesting about what Joel said, because you isolated the objects. I didn't want to touch them. You know, they'd set them up in a sort of kind of composition. So, and I was quite stressed about how to depict Morandi's objects because of how he had done it. And in the end, I decided just to film each of the objects center frame, making composition random, which is obviously the direct antithesis of what he would do. But I also, the markings underneath are, of course, something you have no idea about until you encounter the studio. And I don't know if anyone has done any research on those, because it's full of cipher and codes, I guess, as to, because I remember talking to Carlo Zucchini. I don't know if anyone met Carlo Zucchini.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, an amazing man. But he would, talk about if it wasn't exactly the same weather as the day before when he started painting, he would not continue until the weather was perfectly, exactly the same. So then he would sort of mark it in this way and make a sort of code and do an etching or a drawing instead. But these under drawings, these found drawings or whatever we want to call them, are stunning actually as a found thing. And for me, that was an amazing thing to find, being there, something else. So I ended up making 2 films. One which I called Day for Night, which in a way is because of being the opposite of Morandi. Just, not dealing with daylight, trying to create daylight. The idea of Day for Night is that you film, night in daytime and, you make it look like night. And so I was trying to behave exactly as he wouldn't. So because of his, his rules, I mean, he was quite ruled by rules. So each of these objects is just centered in the frame and the composition is random. So,
Edmund, you've already mentioned being in the studio a little bit. Could you talk to us too about, especially as a maker of vessels, can you talk to us a little bit about his vessels?
Yeah, I mean, what was a complete delight was to find that he used to get tins of kind of just household tins and then paint them white, or fill them with color or wrap them in brown paper. And so many of the vessels are absolutely terrible. I mean, that's what no one talks about, is that they're like Bologna junk shop or back of the cupboard vessels. There are things of enormous beauty that both Tacita and Joel have managed to find within the studio, and which he paints. But also there are things which are extraordinarily kind of flamboyant things from the 1920s, which are, just a sort of eye-poppingly kind of, bizarre, which don't turn up in his paintings or turn up in the early paintings when he was still doing shells and things like that. So what was interesting being there was to feel this sort of propulsive energy of someone who understood the representation of vessels, that how you put vessels near each other, how you find that sort of synapse between different things in a picture plane in 3 dimensions, is where poiesis, where art can really happen. So this connection between objects, and that actually what you got the feeling from was this sort of enormous guiding intelligence of him with his hands. I mean, lovely that roll of paper with the pin, or the kind of a metal sort of Ovaltine tin painted white being brought together. So it's so far from Chardin, in the sense that Chardin has beautiful porcelain objects and they are arrayed, in a way that Proust adores. These are special things that he knows, and with Morandi, you get the sense of someone remaking his life through through how these spaces between objects happen, and then this choreography that Tacita so beautifully kind of filmed. Those extraordinary, they are like dancers' movements, how you record dancers' movements, how one object has to sit next to another. And then in my own, work, I mean, that's kind of, has been a kind of very kind of key part of how I think about how you can make a space where light and shadow can animate objects, where you can let them rest in the world, either through a vitrine or through a shelf or through an object or in a museum or in a space or in a building or in a, and then let the weather happen around it. And so the connection for me is profoundly with Morandi, and being in the studio was thinking about him and time, about just how much time he took to return again and again and again, the iteration of returning to these objects and finding them different as the weather changed, as the seasons changed, as the years changed. And that for me remains very compelling in my own practice and my writing, of course, about objects.
Luc, in your text, you mention repeatedly how tall Morandi was, and that this is something that you've thought about, especially in relationship to the scale of his works. Is that something that when was that you started thinking about that? Was that in the studio, or just confronting the paintings themselves?
Well, I have never visited the studio of Morandi, so
okay.
that was mostly when I saw the paintings, and also became aware of the size of the person who painted them. This was kind of intriguing to me, because it's a clear position. I mean, it's a clear choice also. And yeah, that was intriguing for me.
Both Luc and Edmund write in your texts about time, and Edmund has just mentioned time as well. So I think that's a good place to turn. Edmund, in your text, you write to spend time is to explore time. And Luc's ends with their bitter understanding of the end. One of the things that you discuss in your writings, and that we get to see a little bit as we look at the paintings, is that the objects are covered in a layer of dust. And so I'm curious about that. So let's talk about time and dust. I'm not allergic to dust, but I'm like psychically allergic to dust. And so I think that to be in his studio might actually cause me a lot of anxiety. So can we talk a little bit about dust and what dust does?
And there's a wonderful encounter with the studio in the 50s when John Raywald, the great art critic, visits Morandi, and he says, he writes on the dust of Morandi, they must have been there for a long time on the surfaces of the shelves or tables, as well as on the flat tops of boxes, cans. There was a thick layer of dust, a dense grey velvety dust like a soft coat of felt, providing the unifying element for these bottles and bowls and pitchers and coffee pots. It was a dust that was not the result of negligence and untidiness, but of patience, a witness to complete peace. In the stillness, the dust that covered them was like a mantle of nobility. So it gets rather poetic, but actually it's that idea that actually that's very poetic, but that extraordinary encounter with a studio where those objects had just been there for decades, gently being moved from position to position in these choreographic ways. But that idea of it's worrying. I mean, dust is of course the way that you understand time, but it's also it has a very kind of worrying relationship with death. You know, it's very close to ash. Dust and ash have great kinship with them, and so the studio is also the studio of someone who is marking time iteratively, moving things a bit, letting dust settle again, and is trying to keep, understand his own mortality. I mean, I think that's why I think these still lifes are compelling. The dust is very close to the representation of time.
Joel, when you were moving the objects around, were you concerned about disrupting dust?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even though they gave me carte blanche to touch everything, each one that I faced, I could see the accumulation of fur or dust on them. And so I was very careful to sort of pick it up by the bottom and carry it in such a way so that I didn't destroy any of the accumulation of time on the object. But I had a funny reaction at one point. I thought, oh, this is the home that he grew up in. His mother and his sisters were there. And surely they might have wanted to come in and dust, as sort of Italian mamas like to do. So he must have barred them from that little room so that no dust was ever moved. And there was another accumulation. You remember the easel in the studio with that enormous clump of collected paint on the edge of it. And I read somewhere someone said to him, asked him something about, where his best paintings were. And he pointed to the pile of dried paint on the bottom. And he said, there they are, all the scrapings off of the canvas and accumulating it on the base of the easel. And I thought, he really took his time. His paintings are about a man who loved these cast-off objects that he found, these humble objects, as Edmund said, these ordinary objects from, the stores. And he would sit at his table. And by the way, there are two tables. There's the drafting table with all the circles and marks on it. But he also had built, or maybe built himself, a very tall two-level sort of one table standing on another almost. And he could stand at eye level and look at the ground line, almost at his eye level. So it must have been 6 feet tall. And he moved objects around there too. Sometimes when you see in the painting with a slightly curved horizon line, those are him standing full height, looking at the objects directly rather than looking down at anything. But it seemed to me that the play that he was engaged in was in putting an object down and moving it around until some aspect of it really spoke to him, and then adding another to it and another to it until he assembled some kind of relationship between them that was what was engaging his sort of Zen observation about the relationships between things. So he really took his time, just like dust takes its time to gather. He was like that, I think, in his observations.
Another aspect of his work that, of course, displays a relationship with time is the prints. And I want to talk really briefly about the prints, since Alice has gathered some really fabulous examples of Morandi's prints. And that's, for me, where I can really come to him. How do we think about his prints and print making in relationship to time and decision making in Morandi's practice?
Well, I mean, I can say something. I also wanted to say a few other things, but I think
Please do.
I think he did the prints on cloudy days. I think that was a very practical thing. And I think he sat on the corner of his bed. And Joel, I don't know if you noticed that he was taller than his bed. Did you notice that? I mean, his bed was so small, and
it's true. I thought about his feet dangling off the edge when he took
yeah. So there was a level of discomfort he must have lived with, which was very interesting. And the other thing I wanted to just, did you not think that the studio was set up for a left-handed man? It's funny, no one has ever really pointed it out. And I wondered how much, because there's an aspect of gauche in Morandi's work, but nobody, and I did ask Carlo Sacchini about maybe he must have been ambidextrous, but sometimes he would paint with his left hand. But the way that they had set it up was that it was definitely for a left-handed man, which is an interesting thing that no one really talks about. So I don't know if it's true or not, but that's one of the observations. I'm sorry, I've taken you away from the prints.
No, that's okay. Alice, do you know anything more about that?
Unfortunately, no. But I was thinking about this, and when I've been in Bologna, I didn't notice actually what Tacita you said, that yeah, I should go through this because yes, I've never read anything about this anyway. So you're right. Maybe nobody noticed actually that.
The studio was set up by other people, so I don't really know. We're not actually being in his studio. We're being at the studio
Rita, I think
situated.
you're right. There's the close-up of his portrait. He's got the brush in his left hand.
There you go.
Yeah,
Ta-da.
that's true.
Is
Oh,
being the detective.
we've cracked
I
it.
was thinking about some pictures of him bringing a cigarette on the left hand. I was thinking about this. Yeah.
Why do we think that he felt a need to paint so small? I mean, I understand that perhaps it's just an aesthetic decision, And I've read a lot about how it's because he painted in this single room and it was his living space and his studio space. But then you think about someone like Morris Louis painting in a closet, and those paintings are gigantic. So what is it about the scale of these paintings? What is it behind that decision making, do we think?
Well, I have a question. Did they get smaller? Because the one in the Fellini in Dolce Vita is quite big.
They get smaller at the beginning. If you see, for example, the Natura Morta Metafisica, the metaphysical still life, or even the self-portrait are bigger in scale than following paintings. So
Bigger,
scale,
though not big, right? I mean, bigger.
and yes, and still not big. Yes, of course. And it was not just a question of where he was buying his canvas, because as you may know, he did himself scratches his canvas. So everything, so that's why also we have so different dimensions, and nothing is really regular, in the scale and in the dimension of the paintings. So it was a choice, of course.
Luc, do you have, I'm sorry, Edmund, please go ahead.
Sorry, Luke. It's just a cultural moment as well. I mean, if you look at the literature of mid-century Italy, and I just wish someone would do an exhibition on poetry, and here's a free gift for any curator out there. Honestly, the exhibition on Montale, Ungaretti, and mid-century Italian poetry and Morandi. I mean, you've got quietism, you've got scale, you've got that sense of interiority, and so it's he's not painting in a vacuum. He's painting in the middle of Bologna, and as we know during the war, as well. So the scale of these things is him. And if you think about the poets and the writers who are writing at the same time, there's an interiority about that.
I wanted to say something also. I mean, I think these paintings were also painted in the now. So in a sense, the accuracy of the size that he makes has a direct relationship, which makes this relationship also emotional towards the one who is making it. And I think that's a deliberate choice. I mean, that was also the fascinating thing when I found out that he had that size and deliberately made these size of paintings. Also because of the specific idea of how you can direct your attention span. I think this is in the whole process of dealing with time, through time, which painting actually does. This is a very deliberate choice, as is also the choice of the tonality, which is really important because people don't understand. He didn't really paint in harsh colors. There's also big disruptions in how we evolved from coming from influences from Cubism, metaphysics, and then actually finding his own style in the 30s, which is actually important because he actually makes a decision upon the idea of working within tonality, which is not just the idea of perspective, but it's with the idea of going in depth, and a depth that is realized within the picture frame. And I think, therefore, this idea of condensing the situation is very important.
Yeah, and I agree on, sorry, Amanda.
No,
And
please, I was just going to say that's super insightful. Thank you.
I
Please go ahead.
agree what Edmund said. But I think also that, yes, it is because everything, I mean, he was in Bologna, he was in his room. So, but also when you look at the landscapes, even when he's in Grizzana, he uses these little scale, you know, and also landscapes actually are on these quiet, small dimensions. So you always have like a little glimpse, you know, of something that is in front of him, but he chose just a little. It was like he reframed in some way the landscapes that he had in front of him. So like he was zooming in on some points, and actually it was also always done on a small scale. So I think it's partly because it was his way of approaching reality and objects, but also really the kind of gaze that he had on things, and even not just objects, but also landscapes. So in this sense, I think that landscapes speak a lot, you know, about his approach in terms of dimensions and scale that he chose.
I know that Tacita has to leave in just a few moments, so I want to ask her a question specifically before she goes. Your two works that deal with Morandi, Still Life and Day for Night, are films, but also they're somewhat different, right? One is black and white, one is in color, one faces the objects, one looks down on the objects. And so I'm very curious about this, about the ways that you chose to engage with Morandi's studio in terms of different forms of address, and then also in terms of thinking about color versus black and white.
With Still Life, there are no objects in it at all. That's the black and white one. It's just the paper underneath it. And I mean, it was very simple. I took color and black and white film to Morandi's studio, thinking that I might actually film the objects in black and white, and I didn't know about this underdrawing at all. And then of course I went there. It was very clear that the objects had to be in color, and then this kind of manuscript or document. I mean, this thing was, these are photographs. Actually, they're not from the film, but were clearly worked in black and white. I mean, it's very, very, I'm sorry, I'm wholly practical about these things. That's what I had with me. I mean, the decisions were more about how on earth do you do anything in Morandi's studio? That is the very, very, that's always a problem with artists being invited into a place of pilgrimage, which is what it is, and in the end, as I said, I did everything that Morandi wouldn't do, which is, not worry about make composition random, and also, document this map of his objects, which I think is, I mean, Edmund wants to provoke someone to do an exhibition, but I would love someone to do some research on these things, because I mean, they are a map of his process and time and all sorts of other things, and the reoccurrence of objects. And so obviously some are just lots of circles, but there's so many that have got the curved edges that are so distinctive. So that's all I can really say, and I'm sorry I have to leave, but
that's all right. Practical but perverse as well. I like it. Thank you so much, Tacita.
Can I add a quick
thing? Please, Joel, please go ahead.
Here is a picture of his bottles of pigment that he worked with, and they're full-bodied colors, and then he ground them and mixed them and brought them down to the kind of pale version of themselves. And I think that's a really conscious decision on his part, not to animate the objects with strident colors, or big voices, but to let them maintain their vague characteristics. You know, when I looked at the objects, and each one has a hard edge, and then I would look at his paintings, and you see that wavery line as one object moves back and forth in relation to the other. And he's sort of painting the line between them where they butt against each other. He makes that just a little brush line. So the ambiguity of the air and the space, their relationship to the background and the horizon line, he's dealing with real hard-edged things, but he's keeping them in an ambiguous relationship to each other, because that's what paint does. Paint is gooey. It slides. It's a brush making an edge. It isn't a hard line like the drawing line on the circles around the object's placement. And I think for me, as you know, when you're a photographer, you're stuck with reality. I love it. I'm not stuck with it, but you can't do anything with it unless you want to make it blurry. And I believe in the acuity of seeing in reality. And so I was trying to navigate the space between the hardness of the edge of every single can and block of wood and twist of paper and bottle, and his rendering of it in this soft, malleable way, so that as he moved his playthings around on that surface, as he created the clusters, the little crowds, or the little actors on the scene, I think that's where his spiritual, humorous, observational Zen mind had its anima. It's where it came alive for him when he moved them around there. And his contemplation, I mean, when I sat at the table, I was trying to feel what that contemplative state was like for Morandi as he assembled these objects and tried to find the voices that they could conjoin with and what they had to say.
It's interesting to me, Joel, that you've used the word Zen a couple of times now, and I don't feel Zen when I look at them. I find them very tense, actually. And I'm wondering if I'm alone in this. I feel, especially when I look at the prints, obviously, there's a lot of agitation in them. But there's something about the contour line that becomes background, that then becomes foreground, that then becomes modeling, or the line of the paper that is both an edge and also basically like a proscenium stage. There's something to me that strikes me as incredibly tense about them. Edmund, I see you kind of nodding a little bit. What do you think?
Well, I'd just written "Staging the World" down, so you know that, and absolutely. I mean, for me, there's, you know, there's such there's real exactitude in looking and thinking happening in these pictures. So I don't feel Zen. I mean, I love them. They're, you know, but for me, they have a huge range of different emotions. They're not, you know, they're not just contemplative paintings. That's what, you know, I bang my head against the wall. You know, still life isn't about a kind of, isn't about a contemplative kind of safe space for objects. It's about looking harder and harder and harder at yourself, you know, with fewer and fewer things in front of you. So, you know, that for me is what's happening with these. And there's lots of pressure involved with these paintings, lots of pressure. And the edges of those shelves, the edges of the spaces, feel very vertiginous to me, very, very powerful, and very, you know, I'm present. Sorry, Luc is waving his arms.
Yeah, Luc, tell us.
Yeah, I also think it's not just contemplation. It's all about timing and precision, the whole work. And also, as Joel mentioned, the idea of the line that is painted, which is a different one than a drawn line. So it's a painted line, which can be a contour line, which can be a shade, which can be anything and even nothing at the same time. I think what's really important with Morandi is that it's a person, and that is actually an addition that he made, that actually the process of coming to something is sometimes more important than the outcome. And you, as a painter, have the ability to see how it is made, because there is the pictorial touch that you feel within the object, within the framework. And therefore, I also am convinced that this choice of making that size was a particular choice, was something that had to do with his vision also of how you portray your own physicality as a projection onto the real. And this is something that emanates an immense silence, which I also want to stress, because silence for me is also in my work very important, that the work does not give an idea of silence, let alone music. So there is this sort of blaring silence coming out of this type of work that at the same time gives an element of very huge understatement and being restrained within his sort of like perspective, but extremely ambitious in where it pretends to be big on humility. I think that is actually very important to understand the scope of what was actually projected.
Joel, do you think that the Zen that you feel is related to the sense of humor that you also detect in Morandi's work?
Let me try to clarify.
Okay.
Zen, because I see that it concerned everybody. I wasn't talking about Zen in the painting itself, but in his study, in his contemplation, as Luc says, he's deeply contemplative. He's looking exquisitely hard at every object as he moves them in relation to each other, so that they offer him a starting point to make the painting. I think he incrementally moves things a fraction of an inch forward or back or left or right, so that he creates an ambiguous relationship between things. Because after all, tonally, he's made them, he's painted on the objects themselves, as Tacita had said before. And so and I think that's part of the humor, that he finds an object and he paints the object a color, and then he paints the object in the painting. So I laughed a lot at that. And I thought that by adjusting these minute moves in the space itself, when he's setting up the still life, his enjoyment, his pleasure, and his sense of humor about, well, if I put this a little bit of an overlap on this one, something is going to happen here that will allow me to fool the eye of the viewer. And I think that's where his humor expressed itself to me, is that it's a sleight of hand. This kind of, sort of distraction. When you look at it, you're taken by the whole cluster of 4 or 5 objects, and then you try to kind of parse it. What's in front of what here? How does it relate to the background? So I think that he was a humorous and joyous man who loved spending as much time as he needed to move things around there, so that they gathered their integrated energies together. And that's what appeared to me when I sat in his place and I moved his objects around. I could see how much time could be spent with them in the delectation of their shapes in the light against the serenity of the background. I mean, that's like old butcher paper on the wall. It's only been up there 60 or 70 years. And, it's faded to it's oxidized to its point where it's now some kind of, the fire of time has made everything a kind of monochrome in the background with all of his little paintbrush marks on it. Did you also notice that he painted in a double-breasted suit jacket and he wiped his paintbrush on his jacket's front and on its sleeves? So when you look at his jacket, it looks like he's an admiral full of medals. It's hilarious. And I just thought this guy had a real great sense of humor.
I wonder if Basquiat thought about that when he was painting in his Armani suits. All of you have mentioned the tonality, and so I think that let's let that be the last question for the official question and answer period. And I'm interested. Joel works with found color. Edmund's work, you have a certain tonality that you're working with because of porcelain and your decisions to slip or not to slip. And of course, Luc is famous for his paintings and their decisions around tonality. And so I'm very interested in this, not least because Tacita said, well, when I looked at the objects, those of course had to be in color. And I was dying to ask, well, why? Why did they have to be in color? So I want to end with that. Can we talk a little bit about this ghostly color of Morandi and thinking about ghostliness and time and dust and taking seriously the idea of natura morta, right? Dead life. So let's end with that. Any thoughts?
How long have you got? I mean, that's a huge subject to detonate at this point.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely enormous. The relationship of objecthood to natura morta to ghostliness. Goodness me. I'm going to pass. I mean, that is my life. I mean,
okay.
Well, I think that the importance of working with tonality is in this way interesting that it also works on your memory. It's very difficult to remember tonality. So the image will come to your memory after you have seen it in a different form, which will work on your memory. And as I said before, tonality is something that induces the element of depth within the painterly surface itself, not just as perspective, but as an entity that functions within the brain as being perceived. And so I think that is also the way it reacts to light and the way it reacts to time are things that are intrinsic in terms of the inadequacy of actually what a memory could be. So the element of the image and the after image are actually linked in this perspective. And that's what makes it actually very specific.
So my observation about the color was that the living reality of each of these objects was more colorful in general than what the paintings looked like. The painting seemed to always, he never changed the color if there was red paint poured into a particular bottle and swished around and thrown out. He always made that bottle coincide with the color that it was, but it wasn't always as intense as the original object was, because he's working with a collection of these objects on the table, and I think he had to find the harmony that they spoke to him about, and so he muted or exaggerated or changed, tonally what the painting needed. But the original objects, those pale yellows or that rusty color or the pale blue of a tin that he had, I mean, I think he stayed true to their identity, but that they became something else when they were in this group. Their voices harmonized for him. Their color tone voices, was what he took charge of finally. And it's what we see an atmosphere. These aren't rendered. When I make a photograph of something, I don't create an atmosphere. It is what it is. It sits on the table. It sits in the light. If it is precisely what it is. But in the painting that's up right now, you can feel the weight of the atmosphere in the room. The tenderness of the light. Maybe it was later in the day, and the intensity of whatever bounce of sunlight was out there has faded a little bit, and it's allowed them to accrue a kind of atmosphere, a smoky quality as background and object and tabletop all fused together. He was incredibly in tune with that small space. He was the master of ceremonies of that environment, and look, I mean, look, he's smothered it in some kind of atmosphere all the time, and I mean that's where his art is. It's I mean, that's another place that his art emanates from.
Okay, Natura Morta by smothering. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back to Chloe so that we can have some questions from the audience, and then we'll close with our readings. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for this conversation. We have so many questions. I'm going to try to get to a few of them before we conclude today's program with a couple of readings. The first question is from Francois in the audience. Thank you for the unexpected focus on the mysterious objects in Morandi's Bologna studio. Question for Alice or Joel. Could you provide any information on Morandi's use of a spyglass or telescope when working on his landscape works? Is there any documentation about how he would go about the process of painting and alternating with monocular glances at the motif? Grazie.
I have nothing to add to that. I thought that his paintings, which resembled in some relation to Cézanne's paintings of landscape and houses and hillsides, I thought it was just direct observation, not something that was lens-based.
Well, we know that most of all in Grizzana, he used, yes, a kind of telescope or binoculars, just to, as I told before, to like take a specific glimpse of what he wanted to paint. He never painted outside, was not a plein air painter. So the most of the landscapes that he represented, even out of Bologna, because the one that he represented from his room were this view from the Via Fondazza studio. We have more subjects from the countryside in Grizzana, but we know that everything was done in the studio. So maybe he took some sketches, but yes, we know that he used some of these objects to really reframe his works. I also think it is a specific approach to the landscape, which is treated as a still life as well, as Cézanne did actually. So trying to find like essential forms and in the landscapes and treat them as objects actually. So maybe the use of these telescopes or binocles maybe could help him in some way to take some distance, from to get closer, but at the same time to take a distance from the the vitality, we would say, of the landscape.
Thank you for that answer, Alice, and thank you, Joel, as well. The next question is from D. Wolf, who asks, how does Morandi's relationship to fascism factor into your appreciation of his work, or doesn't it?
Sorry, Chloe, can you repeat quickly the question? Sorry, just to...
Yeah, I can repeat the question. It's from D. Wolf, and it's, how does Morandi's relationship to fascism factor into your appreciation of his work, or doesn't it?
Okay, so I don't know if someone else wants to answer to.
I will say something about it. Yeah, well, that is the question. I mean, there is this idea that first of all there was a certain, he was in agreement with Italian fascism in the beginning. In the end, there is the story that he was incarcerated to the near end of the war because a postcard was found of a friend of his who was in the resistance, and then through his professors he was released pretty quickly. So we spent 3 or 4 days in jail. So I don't really think we know the real positioning of Morandi in the situation. It remains very ambiguous. And that is actually a question mark that remains. I mean, that's also something I addressed a little bit in my text that I wrote about Morandi, which was accompanied with this show in the Beaux-Arts, because the question was, where was the position, what was his position, or what was his position taking in this situation? Was this a form of escapism, or was this something else? So that is a question that remains actually open.
I thank you, Luc, because I have the same relationship of questioning that Luc does. But I'm very interested as well that in a very in the 1950s, Primo Levi, who has to stand for me as the moral conscience of post-war Italian literature, writes a short story in which there is a Dr. Morandi, who he treats with enormous interest and compassion. And I cannot think that Primo Levi is going to write about a character called Morandi with such a generosity and interest. If Morandi, the name Morandi was spoke to fascism in that kind of way.
Well, there were several Morandis. There was also one that had to do with the unification of Italy. There was an archbishop, so there were several Morandis.
I know, but Primo Levi, he's writing about an artist. He's writing about a maker, and so and if you think about Primo Levi in that particular time, just after his books had been republished, there's a very interesting relationship. There is a relationship there that I think needs for me to be uncovered, which is of real significance.
Thank you for your answers. And if I can add just a couple of things, there is a big part of the critics that states that he was fascist also because he stated being in some way a supporter of fascism. There is a short autobiographical note that was published in 1929 in which he states that he supported the regime. So it was the same here. He has his cattedra, at the Belle Arti in Bologna as a teacher. And also some of his works were included in the very first exhibition of the Novecento Italiano, of course, the group that was made up by Margherita Sarfatti. And we know that in that occasion, Benito Mussolini bought a Morandi, actually. So by the end of the 20s, there is this period in which not just Morandi as a man, but most of all Morandi as an artist, and this aesthetic of the strapaese that was very representative in some way of a part of the Italian fascism was really linked to his art. So in some way, we know that his subject, his approach, his discipline, this fact that he was considered as a kind of contemporary old master, really fit with the idea of this contemporary but conservative Italian modern art in the fascist ventennio. So, but by the mid 30s, actually, it was not included anymore in this kind of exhibitions or publications that were linked with the art and the artists that were supported by the regime. So he remained always very sober about his political position. Even after the war, I think it was part of his personality. And I agree with you, Edmund. I don't think that Primo Levi and other art critics would have considered his work so important. And I think that his work would not speak today to us as it does if it was just an expression, we could say, of these very, I would say conservatory Italian modernism that was really appreciated by fascism. So I would stop here. I think we could talk about these hours during hours, but
it remains, of course, it remains ambiguous. That's what it is, in a sense.
Thank you all for those answers, and thank you for that question, D. Wolf in the audience. The last question I'll ask today is from Vasilis. Why did Morandi's work change in the 1920s, and how did the work find itself?
Well, during from 1913 until I would say 1922, 23, Morandi is still looking in some way for his own style, for his way to express his art. So he went through different, very short phases. So I don't want to be too historical, like too art historian in this explanation. I would like really to hear how artists, what you think about this change. But actually, he went through the main avant-gardes of the time. So there is a very short period where it went close to futurism. So in the show, we have a print of this period from 1915, when we can find these very geometrical and dynamic figures. Then there is this short metaphysical period, which I think was a crucial period. A lot of things that you said before about this ambiguity, about this feeling of being in a place but in another, so I think that there is, even if he quit the style, the painting style of metaphysical paintings of the Chirico and Carrà of this period, I think he kept in some way this idea of creating blurred spaces, this ambiguity between space and time, and the connections between objects. So we have the beginning of the 20s, also the very last human figures, the very last fruits. So it's like he's still looking, for his focus. And I think, yes, during the first half of the 20s, he finds this focus on the objects that will be the subject of his still lives, and that will be the origin of infinite, possibilities in his painting.
Great. Well, that's going to conclude our Q&A today, everyone. And thank you so much for all of your questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everyone's, but I want to save a bit of room at the end for a couple of readings that are going to be read. I know, Edmund, you might have read yours already, I think, in the dialogue. You have one other one. Okay, great. So we'll hear at least from Alice, Joel, and Edmund, and maybe Luc.
Okay, so I choose two short quotes by Luigi Magnani, of course. I think it was in the theme of tonight. So Luigi Magnani wrote an essay on 1980 that was titled Il mio Morandi, so My Morandi. So I choose two short extracts. The first talks about how, according to Magnani, Morandi was the man. He talks about Morandi the man and how Morandi the man was linked to his art and his painting. So I'll read in Italian. I'm sorry, I hope it will be clear. L'uomo Morandi è in realtà l'uomo della sua pittura, che se lascia trapelare la sua nobile, mite e pur virile immagine, cui la morte sembra aver impresso un che di grave e immutabile, racchiude inoltre e rende manifeste le più sottili sfumature del suo intimo sentire. Ed è in questo che potremo riconoscere in ogni sua opera un autoritratto. So the second quote is about the subjects of his paintings, and we talked a lot about the time that he spent in his studio, and I'm happy that I choose this quote because we have a kind of answer from the artist about some of the questions that raised. Un giorno, mentre stavo osservando una serie di nature morte in apparenza quasi consimili, appesa ad una parete del suo studio, e mi chiedevo quali incentivi, quali stimoli avrebbe potuto trarre la sua pittura da una maggiore varietà di modelli, Morandi, quasi avesse intuito il mio pensiero e volesse risolvere il mio dubbio, mi disse, indicando quei dipinti: Vede, se avessi una seconda vita, non potrei esaurire lo svolgimento di questo tema. So I don't know if it's clear, but he said, if I had a second life, I'm not sure that I can finish going on the same theme. So I think it was a nice way to end this talk.
Well, could I just quickly read a poem?
Please.
Wallace Stevens, Anecdote of a Jar. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was grey and bare. It did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. So jars and poetry for me.
One of my favorite poems. Really.
Joel, do you want to go next?
Okay. This is not poetry. What I hoped to do by photographing these objects was to simply show what might have been the aspects which Morandi himself responded to, so that we might gain another level of wonder and appreciation for his transformations. What I could not do with a photograph was wrap them in the atmosphere that paint brings to space and form. Okay, Luc, it's all yours.
I'm not going to read anything because it's out of context.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all so much today for today's dialogue. Thank you, Edmund. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Luc. Thank you, Tacita. And thank you, Amanda. Thank you as well to your studio teams and to the team at David's Werner who were so helpful in preparing for today's event. Thank you to the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsors our New Social Environment program and makes conversations like this one possible. They also support our growing archive, which you can view on YouTube and where this video will be shortly. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Stephen Kane, Jay Millar, Liz Worth, and Cole Swenson on the work of Book Hug Press. And as is Rail tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us for this conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank
so much.
you.
Amazing.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you, Edmund. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you,
From
Joel.
Portugal.
Goodbye. Thank you much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
you
so
all.
much.
Wonderful.
Bye. Thank you, Tacita Dean and
Everyone.
Constantia.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Excellent.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.